My husband Arthur had only one rule I never broke. I was never to enter his private workshop alone. After he died, my children saw only a grieving old woman in a house full of junk they wanted to sell. They had no idea that the key to that forbidden room wasn't just a key to a workshop. It was the key to a secret multi-million-dollar life they had never earned. My son, Richard, laid the brochure on the old kitchen table, right next to the worn spot where he'd carved his initials as a boy. The glossy paper was a jarring splash of color against the 50 years of history etched into the oak. Silver willows, active living for your golden years. The people in the photos had professionally whitened teeth and empty eyes. It looked less like a home and more like a high-end holding cell. My daughter, Claire, ever the performer, arranged her face into a mask of gentle concern. It was a look I'd seen her practice in the mirror as a teenager, the one she used before asking for something she knew she shouldn't have. She placed her soft, lotion-scented hand on mine. Her nails were perfect, almond-shaped and painted a pale, lifeless pink. My own hands were a roadmap of my life, knuckles swollen from arthritis, faint scars from slipped chisels, nails permanently stained with the ghosts of wood polish and oil. "Mom, just think about it," she said, her voice a soft purr. "No more stairs to climb, no more leaky faucets to worry about. They have water aerobics and a book club." She was selling me a fantasy, a sterile, pre-packaged version of old age that had nothing to do with me. I imagined myself there, a ghost haunting their pristine hallways, stripped of my home, my memories, my purpose. The thought was a physical blow, a cold fist clenching deep in my gut. Richard, impatient with the pretense, cleared his throat and tapped the screen of his tablet. Spreadsheets bloomed to life. For my son, life was a series of calculations, and my existence had just become an inconvenient variable he needed to solve. "The market analysis is clear," he stated, avoiding my gaze. He was looking at the wall behind me, as if I were already a portrait of a dead ancestor. "This house, in its current condition, is a depreciating asset. We're looking at close to $400,000, but that window is closing. The property taxes alone are unsustainable on your pension." He used financial jargon like a shield, impersonal words to mask the brutal reality of what he was doing. He was liquidating his childhood. He was evicting his mother. The air grew thick and heavy. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the clocks in the hall, a chorus of tiny, frantic heartbeats counting down the seconds of my life in this house. "This is my home," I finally managed to say, the words feeling thin and useless. My voice sounded like a stranger's. Claire's smile tightened. "It's our home, Mom," she corrected, her tone still gentle but now lined with steel. "And we have to be practical." She then had the audacity to pull out her phone, propping it against the sugar bowl. A tiny red light blinked on. "Hi, everyone," she chirped to her invisible audience. "Just having a really important family chat today. Sometimes showing you care means making the tough, responsible choices for the people you love." She was turning my execution into a performance. My pain was her content. My life was her brand. "Arthur wouldn't," I began, the name catching in my throat. Richard's head snapped toward me, his eyes finally meeting mine. They were flat, cold like river stones. "Dad was a wonderful man, Mom, but he wasn't a provider. Not really. He spent his life tinkering with his projects. This house is the only real, tangible thing he managed to leave behind. The only real thing. It was the final twisting of the knife. He dismissed his father's entire existence, his passion, his art, as a footnote to the value of the property. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about moving me out. It was about wiping the slate clean. They wanted to erase the inconvenient, humble truth of where they came from. First him, then me. After the door clicked shut behind them, an unnatural quiet fell over the house. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, filling the void my children had left. Each one was a voice from the past. I walked on unsteady legs into the living room, my hand trailing along the wall for support. My eyes fell on the mantelpiece, crowded with photographs. I picked one up, the silver frame cool against my trembling fingers. Richard's graduation from Wharton, 1998. There he was, 24 years old, his smile wide and full of promise. A world of possibilities reflected in his eyes. He stood between Arthur and me. We looked so proud and so tired. I remembered the weight of that exhaustion, how it settled deep in my bones back then. It was the exhaustion of working 2 jobs, of sleepless nights, of relentless, hopeful sacrifice. I remembered the winter before that photo was taken, the brutal Pennsylvania cold seeping through the old window frames. The acceptance letter had arrived, a thick, creamy envelope that felt like victory. But inside, along with the congratulations, was the tuition bill. $80,000 for the first year. It was an impossible number, a mountain we had no way to climb. That night, Arthur and I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, the bill lying between us like a death certificate for our dreams. We were silent for a long time, the only sound the humming of the old refrigerator. We had a small savings account, maybe $5,000 for emergencies. This was more than an emergency. It was an extinction-level event. Then Arthur stood up and walked into the living room where his clocks were. At the time, he had a collection of 12 pieces he had personally restored. His old guard, he called them. They were his masterpieces, a Willard banjo clock with a reverse-painted glass panel so delicate it looked like a frozen watercolor, a French mantel clock from the Napoleonic era, held aloft by bronze cherubs. He loved those clocks. He spoke to them sometimes when he thought I wasn't listening. He came back to the kitchen, his face set. "We'll sell the old guard," he said. It wasn't a question. I started to protest, the words dying in my throat when I saw the look in his eyes. It was the look of a captain scuttling his own ship to save his passengers. "It's for Richard, Lily," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's for his future, a future where he won't have to choose between his art and his son's education." A week later, a man from a New York auction house came to our home. He was quiet and respectful, his hands clasped behind his back as he inspected each piece. He understood what he was looking at. He saw the hours, the skill, the love. "Your husband is a master, Mrs. Croft," he said softly. "He wrote us a check for $85,000. When he and his team had carefully packed and carried away the last clock, the silence they left behind was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The house felt like it had lost its soul. We sent the money to Wharton the next day. We had sold our past to buy our son a future that now stood in my kitchen and called his father's legacy tinkering. The sale of the clocks wasn't an end. It was the beginning of our secret life. It taught us that our skills had a tangible value far beyond what our humble life in Oakhaven suggested. The need for that value became clear a few years later when Claire sat us down at the same kitchen table, her eyes sparkling, a diamond ring on her finger. She was getting married, and she had a scrapbook filled with pictures torn from bridal magazines. She didn't want a simple wedding. She wanted an event, a grand ballroom at the Bellevue Stratford in Philadelphia, a tiered cake that cost more than our first car, a dress embroidered with hundreds of tiny seed pearls. She presented the budget with the same breathless excitement she'd had as a girl showing us her Christmas list. $30,000. My heart sank as I looked at the figures. Our savings were still recovering. Arthur, however, just smiled and squeezed my hand under the table. Later that night, he went down to his workshop in the basement. The sign on the door read, "Private," but to us it was the heart of our enterprise. For the next 6 months, he worked with a quiet, furious intensity. I became his partner in a way our children never understood. My weekends were spent driving our old Ford pickup to flea markets, church rummage sales, and dusty estate auctions all over the state. Claire called it my hoarding phase. Richard told me I should be careful not to bring bedbugs into the house. They saw a lonely old woman collecting junk. They never saw the huntress. I learned to see past the grime and neglect. I could spot the elegant curve of a Hepplewhite chair leg under a pile of dusty blankets. I could feel the quality of hand-dovetailed joints in a rickety, paint-splattered dresser. I would haggle, my heart pounding, paying $10 for a broken music box that I knew was a rare piece from the 19th century. I'd bring these broken treasures home, and Arthur would take them into his sanctuary. He was a surgeon, a magician. He'd spend weeks patiently, meticulously bringing them back to life. It was a silent conversation between us, a dance of finding and restoring. We were a secret factory of beauty. The money for Claire's wedding came from 3 specific pieces. A magnificent secretary desk, which I'd found with a shattered leg in a barn sale, was sold to a lawyer in Boston for $15,000. A set of 4 Victorian parlor chairs, their velvet upholstery rotted away, went to a decorator in New York for $10,000 after Arthur recarved the missing rosewood details, and I reupholstered them myself. The final $5,000 came from a collection of small, intricate silver pieces I'd polished for weeks. We paid for every part of her fairy tale. And she never asked. She just assumed the money appeared as if by magic. In a way, she was right. It was the magic of our love and our labor, a magic she was blind to. The arrival of Catherine felt like a subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure of our family. She was Richard's wife, and she was everything we were not: polished, wealthy, and effortlessly dismissive. She never said a cruel word directly. Her cruelty was far more sophisticated than that. It was in the way her eyes would scan our living room, a faint, tight smile on her lips, as if she were visiting a quaint, slightly dusty museum of poverty. "Oh, Lily, this is so authentic," she once said, gesturing vaguely at the room. It was meant to sound like a compliment, but we both knew it was an insult. It was her code for old, worn, and worthless. Our invitations to their sprawling home in a gated community outside Philadelphia became less frequent. They were reserved for major holidays, and even then, we felt like charity cases. I remember one excruciating Easter dinner. Richard had invited some partners from his investment firm. They were loud, confident men who talked about golf trips to Pebble Beach and their stock portfolios. One of them turned to Arthur and asked, with a dismissive air, "So, Richard tells me you're retired, Arthur. What was your line of work?" Before Arthur could answer, Richard jumped in with a smooth laugh. "My dad is a master hobbyist. He can build anything out of a block of wood." He said it with a proud, affectionate tone, but the words were a betrayal. He reduced his father's artistry to a hobby, a pastime. He made him small and harmless to fit into his new, important world. I watched Arthur's face. He just smiled a quiet, sad smile and nodded, never correcting his son. He refused to embarrass Richard in front of his new tribe. Claire, always eager to follow Richard's lead, began to treat us with a similar, careful distance. Her blog was her identity, a curated world of clean white spaces and expensive, minimalist furniture. Our house, with its rich, dark wood and the beautiful, complex clocks that Arthur built, was a direct contradiction to her brand. Once she came to visit and spent the entire time trying to convince me to let her declutter. She pointed to a beautiful cherry wood chest Arthur had spent a month restoring. "Mom, this is so heavy and dark. We could replace it with something light and modern from IKEA." She wanted to replace a masterpiece with a particle board box. She wasn't just redecorating. She was trying to sanitize her own history, to replace the authentic, hand-carved truth of her past with a cheap, mass-produced imitation. The big betrayals are easier to see in hindsight. It's the small ones, the everyday cuts, that bleed you out slowly without you even noticing. The forgetting became a constant, dull ache in my chest. For my 65th birthday, I had told the children weeks in advance that all I wanted was a simple dinner, just the family around our kitchen table. I spent the day cooking Arthur's favorite roast chicken. I even baked a cake from scratch, the same one I'd made for their birthdays when they were children. I set the table with my best dishes, the ones we only used for special occasions. 5 o'clock came and went, then 6. At 7, Arthur and I sat down and ate alone in silence, the empty chairs at the table screaming at us. Richard's call came just as I was washing the dishes. The excuse was so polished, so smooth. A last-minute charity gala he and Catherine had to attend. "You know how it is, Mom. It was for the children's hospital. We couldn't say no." He made it sound noble, as if skipping his mother's birthday was a form of public service. Claire's text arrived the next day, a flurry of emojis and empty apologies. "OMG, Mom, totally spaced on dinner. Let's reschedule ASAP. XOXO. ASAP, of course, never came. The rescheduled dinner was forgotten too. The cruelty became more overt, often disguised as a joke. At Christmas, Catherine gave me a gift certificate for a housekeeping service. So you can finally get this place deep cleaned, Lily," she'd said with a bright, false smile. Richard and Claire had laughed along with her. It was a joke, after all, a joke that implied my home was dirty, that I was incapable of caring for it, a joke that cost $300 but felt like it had ripped a piece of my dignity away. The worst, though, was the Thanksgiving, the year before Arthur died. Claire called that morning, her voice thick with fake regret. "One of her kids had a fever," she said. "They were so disappointed, but they couldn't risk exposing Arthur to any germs." It sounded so plausible, so considerate. I spent the day consoling a deeply disappointed Arthur, the smell of a turkey we would not share filling the empty house. That night, unable to sleep, I was scrolling aimlessly on my phone when a new photo popped up on my screen. It was posted by one of Catherine's friends. The photo showed a large, happy group gathered around a feast. In the center of the group, smiling for the camera, were Richard, Catherine, Claire, and all of my grandchildren. They were at a restaurant, the sick child laughing and holding a piece of pie. The caption read, "Annual Friendsgiving. So blessed to have a family you can choose." They hadn't been sick. They had simply made other plans, better plans, and hadn't even had the decency to tell us the truth. They had replaced us. I showed the phone to Arthur. He looked at it for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he simply reached out, switched off my bedside lamp, and plunged the room into darkness. After they had successfully erased us from their social lives, they began to focus on our finances. The language shifted. It was no longer about family. It was about assets. The phone calls always began with a carefully constructed panic. The first big one was from Richard during the 2008 financial crisis. His voice on the phone was a tight wire of anxiety I had never heard from him before. He spoke of market volatility, of leveraged positions, of a liquidity crisis. They were just words to me, but I understood the fear behind them. He needed $20,000. Not as a gift, he insisted, as a short-term loan. "Just for a month, Mom. Just until the market stabilizes. I'll pay you back with 10% interest." Arthur was hesitant. He understood the value of $1 in a way Richard never could. He knew that was the money we had set aside for a new roof, for the day one of us got sick. But the fear in our son's voice was real. How could we say no? Arthur drove to the bank the next morning. He told me the teller, a young woman who had known him for years, looked concerned when he made the withdrawal. He wired the money to Richard's account. A month passed. The market did stabilize, but the money was not repaid. When Arthur finally got the courage to ask, Richard laughed it off. "Dad, you don't understand how these things work. The money is tied up. It's making money for all of us. Just consider it a family investment." It was never mentioned again. It wasn't a loan. It was an acquisition. Claire's approach was less about crisis and more about lifestyle maintenance. Her blog, which was supposed to be a booming business, seemed to cost more than it earned. She called in tears one day. The sponsor for her trip to a luxury wellness retreat in Arizona had pulled out at the last minute. She needed $5,000 to cover the costs, or she would be professionally humiliated. It's a networking opportunity. Mom, it will pay for itself tenfold, she insisted. We gave her the money. Later, we saw the pictures online. Claire by a turquoise pool, a cocktail in her hand. It didn't look like networking. It looked like a vacation we had paid for. The pressure about the house became a constant low-grade hum of anxiety. Richard would email me links to articles about the tax burdens of senior home ownership. Claire would leave brochures for upscale retirement communities on the kitchen table when she visited. They were like birds of prey, circling, waiting. Arthur felt it more than I did. He retreated further into his work, the click of the lock on his workshop door, a definitive sound of separation. He was trying to protect the last thing we had that they hadn't yet touched, our secret. He wasn't just locking them out. In his fear, he was starting to lock me out too. The hardware store is only 3 blocks from our house. Arthur walked there every Tuesday morning. It was his routine, but on this Tuesday, he didn't come back. The call came from a stranger, a man named Jim, the store manager. "Ma'am, your husband, he's collapsed. An ambulance is on its way." I don't remember grabbing my keys or driving to the hospital. The next 3 days became a long, sleepless nightmare lived in the beige-colored limbo of the intensive care unit. The world shrank to the size of that small room. The rhythmic whoosh and beep of the machines, the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic, and Arthur's hand, so still and cool in mine. My children performed their roles perfectly. They showed up, their faces etched with the appropriate level of concern. Richard paced the hallway, speaking in hushed, important tones, into his phone about closing a deal. Claire took a selfie in the waiting room, her face tear-streaked, with a caption about the fragility of life, and posted it before his heart had even stabilized. They brought me coffee in paper cups and told me I needed to get some rest. But they didn't sit. They didn't watch. They didn't share the crushing weight of the silence with me. They were visitors, checking a box of filial duty before rushing back to their real lives. The moment it all shattered happened on the 3rd day. The doctor had just told me that Arthur's heart was too damaged. It was a matter of time. I walked out of his room, needing a moment to breathe, to stop the world from spinning. I sank into a chair in a deserted family lounge down the hall. A moment later, Richard and Claire walked past the doorway, their heads together. They didn't see me. They were speaking in low, practical whispers, the sound carrying in the unnaturally quiet hallway. "The realtor is on standby," Richard said. "He can have the photographer there the day after the funeral." He couldn't even say the word. "We need to get all of Dad's junk out of the basement workshop first. That's the biggest job. It will take a dumpster, maybe 2. Claire's voice was even more chilling. "What are we going to do about Mom? She's going to be emotional. She won't be practical about this." Richard's reply was cold, swift, and absolute. "She doesn't have to be practical. She just has to sign the papers. We'll move her into Silver Willows, and we'll take care of the rest." I didn't breathe. I just sat there frozen as the world I knew ceased to exist. They weren't my children. They were strangers, business partners discussing the liquidation of an inconvenient estate. My husband was not their father. He was a problem whose junk needed to be cleared. I was not their mother. I was an emotional obstacle to be managed. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked back to Arthur's room. He must have seen it in my eyes, the absolute desolation. He squeezed my hand, a flicker of his old strength returning. He pulled my ear close to his lips, his breath a faint whisper against my skin. "Lily," he rasped, each word a monumental effort. "Time. Ask the grandfather. He knows." His hand went limp in mine. The long, steady tone from the heart monitor was the sound of my old life ending and a new, terrible one beginning. The days following the funeral were a thick, gray fog. The house, once filled with the comforting heartbeat of Arthur's clocks, was now oppressively silent. My children treated me with a suffocating, gentle kindness that felt more threatening than anger. They brought me casseroles and sorted through paperwork, their movements efficient and purposeful. They were waiting for me to break, to collapse, so they could step in and take care of things. But through the fog of grief, Arthur's last words began to cut through, a beacon in the darkness. Ask the grandfather. He knows. It was a riddle, a piece of nonsense whispered in the delirium of death. Yet the more I thought about it, the more it felt like a command. Arthur was the most deliberate man I had ever known. He did not waste words, not even his last ones. The grandfather, our name for the majestic tall case clock that stood sentinel in our front hall. It was the first piece we ever bought together, a broken, silent giant we found at an auction 50 years ago. Arthur had spent a year bringing it back to life. It was the cornerstone of our entire existence. One night, after another day of my children's suffocating concern, I walked into the hall. The moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the clock's hand-painted face, a celestial scene of a golden moon and silver stars. I ran my hand down its smooth, cool mahogany side, a silent greeting to an old friend. I opened the glass door and touched the clock hands, then the heavy brass weights behind the lower door, feeling for anything out of place. Nothing. My hope began to curdle into despair. I was a foolish old woman chasing ghosts. I was about to give up when I remembered how Arthur used to clean it. He was meticulous. He would clean every part inside and out. I knelt down, my old knees protesting, and ran my fingers along the inside of the case, just as I had seen him do. My fingertips snagged on a tiny, almost imperceptible seam in the back panel. It wasn't a crack. It was a cut. I pressed, and a section of the wood clicked inward, revealing a dark, hollow space. My breath caught in my throat. Reaching into the darkness, my trembling fingers closed around two objects. The first was a heavy iron key, ornate and ancient, unlike any key in our house. The second was a thick leather ledger. I carried them to the kitchen table, the same table where my children had sentenced me to exile, and opened the book. The pages were filled with Arthur's elegant script. It was a secret history of our lives. Dates, client initials, descriptions of restored pieces, and numbers. Astonishing numbers that made my head spin. It was the complete financial record of Masters of Time. On the final page, written in a shakier hand, was a single name and a Philadelphia phone number, Alistair Finch. Below it, one last sentence. For Lily, when the time is right. Arthur hadn't left me a riddle. He had left me a roadmap, a weapon, and the time was, without a doubt, right. The phone felt impossibly heavy in my hand. I dialed the number for Alistair Finch, my heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm. He was a legend in the antique world, a dealer known for his sharp eye and even sharper tongue. We had sold pieces through him for decades, always discreetly, always through Arthur. I had never spoken to him myself. A voice answered, as crisp and dry as an autumn leaf. Finch. I took a shaky breath. Mr. Finch, this is Lillian Croft, Arthur's wife. A pause stretched across the line, a silence so profound I thought he had hung up. Then his voice came back, layered with a warmth I didn't expect. Lillian, I am so deeply sorry for your loss. The world is poorer without your husband's hands in it. I've been waiting for your call. Arthur had a plan, a comprehensive, posthumous plan. I took the train to Philadelphia the next morning, the ledger wrapped in a scarf and tucked into my bag like a sacred text. Alistair's shop was a treasure cave, tucked away on a cobblestone street, smelling of beeswax and old leather. He was a tall, willowy man with a mane of unruly white hair and eyes that seemed to look right through you. He greeted me not with a handshake, but with a gentle hand on my shoulder. He was a good friend, Lillian, a true artist, and he was worried, for you. He led me to a back room and I placed the ledger on a massive oak desk. He opened it and nodded. "The Bible," he murmured. "He told me you'd find it." He spent the next hour walking me through the secret empire Arthur and I had built without ever fully understanding its scale. The clients were not just lawyers and doctors. They were museum curators, international collectors, people who moved in a world of unimaginable wealth. The numbers I had seen were just the beginning. After his commissions and our living expenses, Arthur had reinvested everything. He didn't trust the stock market, Alistair explained, a twinkle in his eye. He said it was imaginary. He trusted tangible things, things with history, things with soul. He stood up, and he wanted to show you what he built, for you. He led me from his shop down the street and into a narrow alley. We stopped in front of a large, anonymous black door on a plain brick warehouse. There was no sign, no number. He took the heavy iron key from me, the one from the grandfather clock. It slid into the lock and turned with a deep, resonant thud. He pushed the heavy door inward and stepped aside. "Welcome, Lillian, to the headquarters of Masters of Time." I stepped across the threshold and into another world. It wasn't a workshop. It wasn't a storage unit. It was a breathtaking 2-story gallery, professionally lit to showcase dozens of masterpieces. Every piece Arthur and I had ever restored and sold to our anonymous clients was here. They hadn't been sold. They had been preserved. I saw the Willard clock, the French cherubs, the rosewood desk. It was all here, a stunning multi-million-dollar collection. Our life's work, assembled in secret. It wasn't just a fortune. It was a testament. It was our story, waiting to be told. I spent 2 full days in that gallery walking from piece to piece, my hand tracing the familiar curves of the wood, the cool smoothness of the brass. It was a pilgrimage through my own life. Each object whispered a memory, the thrill of a flea market discovery, the quiet satisfaction of watching Arthur work, the shared pride in a finished piece. Alistair gave me the space I needed, quietly providing me with tea and the final set of documents Arthur had left in his care, a meticulously crafted will, trust agreements, and deeds of ownership. Everything was in my name, ironclad and untouchable. The grief I had been drowning in began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. A plan began to form, not out of hatred, but out of a fierce, protective love for what Arthur and I had built. I made the call that Friday afternoon. My voice was steady, devoid of the emotion they expected from me. "Richard, Claire, I need you to come to Philadelphia tomorrow morning. I'm at a warehouse where some of Dad's things are being stored. I need you here for the appraisal before we send them to auction." The word auction was the magic spell. The greed in their voices was immediate and undisguised. They promised to be there, no excuses, no delays. They thought they were coming to claim their inheritance. They had no idea they were walking into a final judgment. They arrived together, their faces a mixture of impatience and predatory excitement. They looked at the unassuming black door with disdain. "This is it?" Richard asked, scanning the grimy alley. I expected something more. Substantial. I simply smiled, a small, tight smile that didn't reach my eyes, and unlocked the door. I let them walk in ahead of me. The moment they stepped out of the alley's gloom and into the gallery's warm, perfect light, they stopped dead. The sound of their indrawn breaths was the only sound in the vast space. They were utterly, completely silent. They stared, their jaws slack, as they took in the impossible collection of treasures surrounding them. Richard, the banker, was the first to move. He walked as if in a trance toward a magnificent Chippendale desk, a piece he had dismissed as firewood years ago. He leaned down to read the small, professionally printed card at its base. George III, period mahogany desk C. 1770, restored by Arthur Croft. Estimated value, $220,000. He physically recoiled, as if the words had burned him. Claire drifted through the room like a sleepwalker, her hand fluttering out to touch a piece, then pulling back as if afraid it would vanish. "What is this?" she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "Mom, what is all this?" I let the silence hang for a moment longer before I answered, my voice clear and strong, echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "This is your father's life. This is the junk and the tinkering that paid for your life." I began to walk, pointing to different pieces as I spoke. "That French clock, Richard? Its twin paid for your Wharton MBA. That set of rosewood chairs, Claire? They paid for every detail of your fairy tale wedding. You grew up surrounded by beauty and genius, and you were both too blind and too arrogant to see it." Alistair Finch stepped out from a quiet corner, holding a leather-bound folder. "Arthur Croft's will is quite clear," he announced. "The entirety of this collection, and the trust that owns it, is bequeathed solely to his beloved wife, Lillian." I then walked up to my stunned, silent children and handed each of them an envelope. "Your father and I believe an inheritance should be earned," I said softly. "You have earned this." Inside each envelope was a check for $1,000 and a meticulously detailed invoice for every loan, every gift, every dollar they had ever taken from us. The shock on their faces curdled into disbelief, then into pure, ugly rage. Richard was the first to find his voice, a strangled, incredulous sound. "An invoice? You're invoicing your own children? This is a joke." He crumpled the papers in his fist, his knuckles white. "This is sick. You can't do this." Claire began to sob, but her tears were not for the years of our sacrifice or for the father she had misjudged. They were tears of pure, selfish loss. "You lied to us," she wailed, her voice echoing in the beautiful, silent room. "Our whole lives you lied. You pretended to be poor." "We were never poor, Claire," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "We were rich in ways you will never understand. We had our work. We had our love. We didn't lie. We protected our legacy from the very people we thought we could trust. And seeing you both now, I see how right your father was to do so." I looked at Richard, at the fury twisting his handsome face into something ugly. "You stood in a hospital hallway and called my husband's work junk while he was dying. You planned my eviction. You don't get to stand here now, surrounded by his genius, and accuse me of anything." Alistair, a silent, imposing presence, took a single step forward. It was a clear, unspoken signal. The audience was over. Richard started to bluster about lawyers, about contesting the will, about having me declared incompetent. Alistair cut him off with a single cold sentence. "Mr. Croft, every document is ironclad. Every asset is protected in a trust that was established a decade ago. Your father was many things, but a fool was not one of them. I suggest you leave." Defeated, they stumbled out, the sound of their angry, bitter accusations fading as the heavy door clicked shut behind them, sealing them out of my life for good. The aftermath was a quiet storm of paperwork and planning. With Alistair's guidance, we officially established the Croft Foundation for the Preservation of Artisanal Craftsmanship. The gallery would be its home, a place of learning and beauty. My children, as expected, made attempts to breach the new walls I had built. I received a barrage of voicemails, a predictable cycle of rage, then tearful pleading, then venomous threats. I listened to the first few, then simply began deleting them unheard. One evening, an enormous bouquet of expensive lilies arrived at my door, the kind of grand, empty gesture Claire specialized in. The card read, "We can fix this. We're family." I took the flowers and placed them on Arthur's grave. The next day, I had my phone number changed. Family is built on love and respect. It has been a year since I closed that door on my children. The house in Oakhaven is still my legal address, a quiet anchor to my past. but my life is now in Philadelphia, in the small, light-filled apartment I had built above the gallery. I wake each morning to the faint, pleasant smell of sawdust and lemon oil, a scent that I once associated only with Arthur, but now associate with my own purpose. The Croft Foundation is no longer just an idea, it's a living, breathing entity. Our first class of 6 apprentices are learning the arts of woodworking, gilding, and clock repair, their youthful energy a balm to my old soul. I see Arthur's legacy not as a collection of static objects, but as a transfer of knowledge, a flame being passed to a new generation. I am not the woman I was. That quiet, accommodating, invisible woman died in the hospital hallway with my husband. The woman who took her place is someone I am still learning to be. She is the president of a foundation. She is a lecturer who speaks to museum groups about the intricacies of 18th century joinery. She is a mentor who is, for the first time, unafraid to claim her own expertise. I found my voice in the echoing silence of that gallery, and I'm surprised by how strong it sounds. I don't hear from Richard or Claire. Alistair, through his network of connections, occasionally gives me updates I don't ask for. Richard, without the safety net of his family investment, made a series of reckless financial decisions and lost his job. They had to sell their grand house. Claire's blog about curated perfection lost its authenticity when her own life became messy and imperfect. Her audience, sensing the bitterness behind her posts, moved on. I feel a distant, abstract sadness for them, the way one might feel sad about a story of strangers who made all the wrong choices. The fierce, painful love of a mother has been cauterized by their betrayal, leaving behind a clean, neat scar. Last week, a young woman, one of our apprentices, brought me a small, broken wooden bird she had found. Its wing was snapped. "Do you think," she asked, her eyes full of hope, "we can fix it?" I took the small, broken thing in my hands, feeling the delicate craftsmanship. I thought of my own life, of the pieces I thought were shattered beyond repair. I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Yes," I said, "I know we can." My own children may have thrown me away like something broken, but I have learned that, with the right hands and the right heart, anything can be restored.